All right, well, I this week was thinking about people and all the different kinds of people that there are. And so I kind of made a list here because, I kind of got thinking about this about Nehemiah. I was reading through Nehemiah and seeing these different types of people. And this is not an exhaustive list. These are the ones I just put down here on the paper. And yes, I know that a few of these are not real words. I was trying to get all of them to end in ists. So some of them, don't correct my grammar. My spell check has already told me that's not a real word. But hopefully you'll get the point here, all right? So we start with destructionists or demolitionists. Those are people that are always tearing things down or destroying them. Then we have constructionists. Constructionists do the opposite. They build things up or they repair them. There are obstructionists. They get in the way of progress. They're always blocking what you need to do. There are observationists. Observationists, they just sit and watch everything that's happening. They never do anything themselves. They just sit and watch it. And my great aunt, when I wrote that down, I thought of my great aunt Thelma. Wonderful lady. But she would just sit. She never said anything. She would just sit. She'd sit in the back in church, and that's what she did in church. Scan the room, looking at everybody, seeing who's talking and who's not, and who's sleeping and who's not. And she probably knew more about everybody than anybody else did because she just sat there and observed. Never did anything, but she observed everything. Visionists. That's probably, I think, one of the words that's not a true word, visionist. Visionary is a word, but visionists. They see what could be. Not just what is, they see the future. They see what could be. There are theorists. Theorists are great in coming up with theories. But most of the time, they never do anything with their theory. It's just theory. This is the way I think it should be, and if everybody would just do it this way, then things would be great. There are strategists. Strategists are the ones that take vision and put legs on it. Make it do something. Now, the greatest combination is when you have a visionist and a strategist together. They can cast the vision, come up with a vision, and then figure out how to make it happen. But there are some people that don't have both gifts. I have been at churches where the pastor was a great visionary, but wasn't a very good strategist. So he brought people under him to help make the vision happen. The pastor needs to be the vision caster. The pastor needs to be the one hearing from God and casting the vision. But sometimes they need a team of people to help put that vision into action and carry that on. Then we have antagonists. Antagonists never do anything useful themselves, but they're always telling other people why they're not doing it right or how they could do it better or why it shouldn't even be done that way. And then there are reactionists. Reactionists just do the first thing that comes into mind in every situation without thinking about, something, okay, let's do this, and they just do it. And then usually it's wrong because they didn't really pray about it and think about it and strategize it and talk to other people about it. That's just some of them. I also came up with a bunch of others, realists and different things like that. Well, for the past few weeks, we've been going through the book of Nehemiah. The main character in this book, of course, is Nehemiah. And I wrote that, and I thought, actually, no, it's not. The main character in this book is God. The book is named after Nehemiah. It's kind of the story of Nehemiah, but we need to remember the real main character in Nehemiah is not Nehemiah. Just like any other book that has the name of a person. In every book, the main character is God. The whole Bible is the story of God. So we need to keep that in mind. Okay, but Nehemiah is the one we're focusing on for a lot of this because it's his story. Nehemiah himself constantly refers to God and declares that all the victories that he has, he keeps giving the glory back to God. Nehemiah takes none of the credit for himself. He says, because of God, we were able to do this. So in the book of Nehemiah, we can find almost every one of those people that I described a minute ago, as well as others. The story essentially starts 160 years before the book of Nehemiah was written. The Babylonians came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They were the demolitionists or the destructionists. Then in the first chapter, we read about some observationalists. Nehemiah's brother and some other men came to visit Nehemiah, and Nehemiah asked them about the state of the city, and they told about the city. They had observed everything, but they had no vision, they had no strategy. They were just observationists. And that's the way most people living in Jerusalem at the time were. They were all observing it. Almost everybody saw the condition of the city. Most of them knew that it wasn't right. Some of them probably asked why nobody was doing anything about it. But for them, even though they agreed that something should be done and that things weren't right, nobody was willing to step up and do something about it. I was thinking about that, and it reminded me of the story of anybody, nobody, somebody, and everybody. How many have heard that story? You should have if you've been here, because I've told the story a few times. So I decided to rewrite the story this morning for the book of Nehemiah. All right, so bear with me here. Nehemiah is a story about everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. The walls were in shambles, and everybody knew that something needed to be done, but they were all waiting for somebody to do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Everybody was frustrated at the fact that nobody was doing what anybody could have done, but the only thing that anybody ever did was complain. Everybody was waiting for somebody to do something, but it was really everybody's job. Finally, somebody by the name of Nehemiah decided to do something other than complain, and he was able to get everybody to help him. Anybody could have probably accomplished the task by themselves if they had spent the 60 years that everybody had been living in the city waiting for somebody to do something. But when somebody finally organized everybody to work together, the task was accomplished in only 52 days. That's the story of Nehemiah, so we're done. You can go home. No. You know better than that, don't you? Back to the real story as written in the Bible. It started with the destructionists and the observationists, but then quickly moves to Nehemiah, who was both a visionist and a strategist. Nehemiah was able to pull the observationists together and turn them into constructionists because they worked together. They accomplished a task that many would have said was impossible. How many are following me? Am I going too fast for you? All right. In chapter 3, we read about the various groups of people that Nehemiah was able to pull together to accomplish the task. Even though the people came from many different backgrounds, and most of them had never done anything even closely related to the task on hand, they put their differences aside and focused on the one thing that they could agree on. The walls needed to be built, and Nehemiah had a plan on how to do it. So they got behind his plan, and they worked together, and they accomplished it. Chapter 4 introduces another group of people. These people are antagonists or obstructionists. We actually read about these people briefly in chapter 2. But I mentioned them just in passing. I said we'll come back and talk about these people later. So today we're going to come back and talk about them. Today we're going to address the opposition. In fact, the chapter 4 in my Bible is titled Opposition to the Rebuilding. Now, once again, I'm not going to read the whole chapter in Nehemiah 4 because I'd probably bore you with it. So instead, I want to encourage you to read it on your own later today or sometime this week. And I'm going to focus on just a few principles that we gain from that chapter. Because just like we did last week, there's a lot of chapters we try to skip over. We say, why are they even there? These are boring. Why do I need to know all this kinds of stuff? Everything in the Bible is there to teach us something, but usually it's the principles it's trying to teach us. We need to glean what are the principles, what are the lessons that I can apply to my own life. So I want to try to bring out a few principles from chapter 4 of Nehemiah. Principle number 1, expect opposition. Expect opposition. Nehemiah is doing God's work. He also has the authority from the king. Now, you would think that somebody that has the authority of both God and the government, their job would be easy, wouldn't you? What other authority do you need? I've got the government's backing, I've got God's backing, so this should be piece of cake. But the book of Nehemiah is a great reminder that we always face opposition. In fact, I'd like to propose the idea this morning that the only time you will not face opposition is if you aren't doing anything. The Bible clearly teaches there are two opposite forces at work today. There are the forces of good, God, and the forces of evil, Satan. Those two forces are complete opposites and in opposition to each other. If you're working for the devil, you should be facing opposition from God, and you will be facing opposition from God in some way because God is always trying to get your attention and call you back to him. If you're working for the devil, or if you're working for God, you will be facing opposition from Satan because Satan is opposed to anything that God tries to do. So you will have opposition. If you're not facing opposition, it's because you're not doing anything. Because if you're not doing anything, everybody's going to leave you alone. You're not a threat, right? So expect opposition. If you have nobody that's opposed to you, nobody that's trying to tell you you're doing it wrong, then you better stop and think, what am I really doing? Because if you're doing something, you will have opposition. The people have been living in Jerusalem for 60 years, and there was no opposition that we know of because nobody had done anything. They were all looking around and seeing it, but nobody was getting involved. So there was no opposition. Their enemies left them alone because they were no threat. The government left them alone because they were just paying their taxes and whatever needed to be done. They were just kind of breezing through life. And it was pretty simple, but it wasn't right. But now they're starting to do something, and since they're starting to do something, the opposition raised its ugly head. Nehemiah chapter 4, starting at verse 1, says, when Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. Now, that doesn't mean he smelled good. Doesn't mean he put on his Old Spice. He was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews. And in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah, the Ammonite who was at his side, said, what are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. Now, who were these two men? Why would they be so opposed to the building of a wall? To answer that question, we need to go back to chapter 2. In chapter 2, verse 10, we read this. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of Israel. There's another guy that we read about in Nehemiah, and he also appeared a little bit later in chapter 2, and we're going to see his name continuing to come up because he's in cahoots with these two guys. They're all best friends. His name is Geshem. He also appears for the first time in chapter 2, and we're going to look at the verse in a minute, but I want to point out right now, it says Geshem was an Arab. Okay? So we've got the Horonite, the Ammonite, and the Arab. Now, let me give you a little history. Let's back up a little bit. The Horonites, the Ammonites, and the Arabs were three of the people groups that God had driven from the promised land for the Israelites. When Joshua came into the land, said, drive out everyone that's there. Actually, what he said was destroy them, because if you don't destroy them, they're going to seduce your women, and they're going to get you to follow their gods. And so he actually said, get rid of them because they're bad apples. And one bad apple messes up the whole pot, right? Okay, but Israelite came in, instead of destroying them like God said, the Israelites just kind of pushed them out and said, okay, you just go out here. We're taking over this part of the land, but you can be our neighbors. And that caused problems with them all throughout history. That caused problems for them because they didn't follow God's plan. And that's really why they ended up going 70 years in captivity in Babylon, because it was God's punishment on them for going and following the religion of serving the gods of these other nations instead of serving the one true God. All right? So during the 160 years since Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonians and spent most of the time in captivity, but now they've been back for approximately 60 years, but they're not doing anything. During that time, these nations who had originally been driven out had begun to take over the territory again. They were moving back in. They were once again becoming prosperous because the Israelites were not a threat to them. And they were enjoying the prosperity that they were getting. Sanballat and Tobiah were regional governors serving under the king of Persia. The king of Persia's way of ruling was much like the way the Romans ruled in the New Testament. They let everybody keep their own religion. They didn't come in and say, okay, now we're in charge. You got to follow our way of life. You got to follow our customs. You got to follow our gods. They come and said, you can do anything you want to as long as you're paying your taxes. As long as you're not trying to overthrow us, you can do whatever you want. That's what the Romans did. The Romans didn't even care. And we talked about this, I don't have time to get into this right now, but the Romans were not the ones that crucified Jesus. It was the religious Jews. The Romans really were not the ones that were against Christianity when Christianity was established. The Roman government didn't care. It was the religious Jews that were persecuting the church. So these guys are there. The economies of the regions that these two men governed were booming, and if Jerusalem was rebuilt, it was going to affect their prosperity. Before Jerusalem had been destroyed, Jerusalem was the hub of trade in the area. Jerusalem was situated on a major trade route. Everything had to come in and out through Jerusalem. Without walls around Jerusalem, those other regions could come and go as they please. But they know that once Jerusalem is once again secure, their access is once again going to be limited. Jerusalem could start charging tariffs on the goods coming through the city. What was good for Jerusalem and what was good for God's people wasn't good for these other people. So no wonder they're opposed. They're looking out after themselves, which we all do, right? Naturally, they weren't happy about the work that was being done. So principle one, if you're going to do anything, expect opposition. If you don't want opposition, if you don't like conflict, then don't do anything. But that's not God's way. Number two, ignore what you can, or another way to say that is choose your battles. Every battle is not worth fighting. How many have learned that? Every battle is not worth fighting. So far, everything that Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem have done has consisted of words. So far, they're simply antagonists. They're criticizing the work. They're mocking the workers. They're trying to get the workers to doubt that what they're actually doing is actually going to accomplish anything. Read with me in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. Actually, just kind of look through that. We already read it. These are the things they say. Will they restore their wall? Another way of saying what they're doing is they're trying to put doubt into people's mind. Are they actually capable of this? And we talked about that last week. No, really, they weren't. There wasn't anybody there who knew how to build a wall. It was perfumers, and it was cupbearers, and it was gold workers, people who didn't know anything about it. And they're trying to get the people to understand, we don't really know what we're doing. How can we actually accomplish this? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Because remember the first lesson we had on Nehemiah? Part of Nehemiah's goal, why did he want the walls built? He wanted to bring true worship back to Jerusalem. They had rebuilt the temple, but they still weren't really worshiping the true God. And he knew as long as these other nations have free access to come and go from it, true worship is not going to be totally established. That was his purpose for it, to say, can they even do it? That they can't do it. Are they really? They think they're going to be able to worship their God again. They're just dreaming. That's really what they're saying. Can they bring stones back to life from those heaps of rubble? In other words, they say it's a futile attempt. Those walls are destroyed too badly. There's no way that anything good can come out of that. It's too far gone. What are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down the walls of stone. They're going to spend all their time doing all this work, and then as soon as they're done, the first time a fox jumps on, it's going to fall down because they don't know. Again, going back to putting doubt into people's minds. You can't really accomplish. You might as well just give up because this is a futile attempt. These antagonists had done the same thing back in chapter 2. But that time they questioned whether or not Nehemiah actually had the authority to do what he was doing. And again, it wasn't for Nehemiah because Nehemiah knew he had the authority. They were trying to get the people to question, does this man really have the authority? Do you really want to follow him? Because he doesn't have the right authority, and the king's going to come in and shut him down. Back in chapter 2, verse 19, it says, when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? Trying to get the people to say, don't listen to Nehemiah. He's telling you a bunch of lies. He's rebellious. And if he's rebellious, when he gets punished, if you go along with him, you're going to be punished right along with him. Now, it's important to understand this question they were asking was not a serious question. Are you rebelling against the king? Nehemiah had the papers to back him up. He had the letter sent by the king saying, Nehemiah is now the governor of Jerusalem, and he has my permission to build the walls. Not only does he have permission to build the walls, I'm sending the materials that he needs to build the walls. He is doing it under my authority. They knew he had the authority. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the people to question Nehemiah's authority. They're trying to get the people to believe that the letters that Nehemiah had were forged. They weren't actually from the king. Now, I want you to notice what Nehemiah did in both those situations, back in chapter 2, and what he does to the accusations that they make in chapter 4. What does Nehemiah do? He essentially ignored the accusations. He did give a brief response in chapter 2, which we're going to look at in a minute, but he didn't engage in a long argument about whether or not he had the proper authority, or whether or not the walls would be able to stand up to a fox, or whether or not the stones were reusable. It wasn't worth the effort. He simply kept doing what God had asked him to do. Any time he spent engaging the antagonists was time that he wouldn't be spending on the task that he was trying to accomplish. So for the most part, he simply ignored them. He decided this battle wasn't worth fighting. It would be a waste of precious time. So he just kept on working. And every time I say that, I think of Finding Nemo. Just keep swimming, just keep swimming. Just keep working, just keep working, just keep working. Ignore everything else, just keep working. We see the same thing happening in chapter 6. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, we're moving ahead a little bit now, we're trying to get Nehemiah to have a meeting with them. They're trying to interrupt the work, trying to get him to stop what he's doing to come meet with them. And this is what he says in chapters 3 and 4. Listen to this. Verses 3 and 4, chapter 6. So I sent messengers to them with this reply. I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? Because he recognized them for who they were. They're not part of it. They really have no valuable input. They're just antagonizing. They're just obstructing. They're just trying to get in the way. I'm not going to waste my time with them because I have something that's too important. I'm carrying out a great project, cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? 4 times they sent me the same message. Come meet with us. And each time I gave them the same answer. No, I'm not going to give you the time of day. I'm working. I'm going to keep working. Just keep working. Just keep working. Most of the attacks that come against us are not physical. They're mental. The enemy tries to distract us and get our focus on other things so that we will stop doing what we should be doing. His goal is to simply stop us. And if he can get us to engage in battles of the will or battles of the mind, he's accomplished his goal. Because while we're fighting those battles that aren't worth fighting anyway, we're not accomplishing what God has asked us to do. We need to know which battles are worth the effort and which ones we can ignore. Principle 3, pray or give it to God. There's an old saying that says, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But we all know that words can hurt, right? They can be painful. But the only way words can do any damage is if we allow them to. Words can only hurt if we dwell on them, or if we make them worse by engaging in a conversation and arguing with somebody. Oh yeah? Well, you know what you are? That makes things worse. That doesn't help. Nehemiah was able to ignore the words, because that's all it was words. Nehemiah was able to ignore the words spoken by these antagonists because he turned it over to God. He said, you know what? I'm not going to let this be my problem. I'm going to forget what they're saying because I'm only listening to one voice. So God, you take care of this. You deal with it. We read that in Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. He says, hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. Now, we need to be careful that we don't turn Nehemiah's prayer here into a model prayer, because it's not really the kind of prayer that Jesus asked us to pray. Nehemiah is praying that God would turn their words against them and he'd bring the enemy in to take them as captives and all this stuff. That's really not the kind of prayer. So let's not learn a principle about the type of prayer to pray, okay? Because we want to pray the kind of prayer that Jesus prays. Jesus says, pray for your enemies, but what he was saying is pray blessings up on your enemy. Pray good will happen to them. You know what? If God blessed your enemies enough, they're going to forget about you because they got enough blessings. They don't need to worry about you. That's kind of what Jesus is saying. So let's not turn his prayer into a model prayer. But the principle is this. We need to let God fight our battles. Nehemiah prayed about it, said, God, you take care of this. I'm going to keep working. And because he had given it to God, he didn't worry about it anymore. He just kept doing what he was supposed to be doing. Romans chapter 12, verse 9 says, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. Psalms 18, verses 2 and 3. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I have been saved from my enemies because I let God take care of it. I didn't engage on my own. I let God do it. Now, as we read through the rest of chapter 4, you're going to see that Nehemiah did prepare the people just in case they needed to actually engage in war. He had everyone carry a weapon with them just in case the enemy actually turned their threats into actual violence. And he had the people work in shifts. Half the people worked while the other half of the people kept an eye out for the enemy. And he posted a night guard to keep an eye over the city at night because the gates and walls were not yet there, so they had to have guards to watch, and they couldn't just expect the gates to protect them. Even though Nehemiah trusted God to take care of things, he didn't ignore the fact that there was a real threat. He prayed that God would intervene and take care of things so that he wouldn't have to, but he was prepared to fight if necessary. But he knew that even if it came to a real fight, it wouldn't be his strength or the strength of his people. It would be God's strength that would defend them. Which brings us to the fourth principle of today. Remember who is in charge. Remember whose battle it really is. It's not our battle. It's God's battle. Remember whose vision it is. It's not my vision. It's not Nehemiah's vision. It's God's vision. Who is the one that's ultimately in charge? Once again, I want to take you back to chapter 2 to see what Nehemiah's response was to the antagonist the first time they caused problems. They told him, you can't do this. You're rebelling against the king. And this is part of what he said. In verse 20, I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. This isn't my mission. It's God's mission. So I don't care what you say, because if I'm doing what God tells me to do, it's going to be successful. Because God's in charge. I'm simply the one doing the work, but it's God's vision, and God's going to give me the strength to carry it out. David said essentially the same thing when he faced Goliath. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 45 to 47, we read this. The Philistine was taunting him. Yeah, the Philistine was big, and he did have armor and swords and spears and all that kind of stuff. But it was really, up to that point, just taunts. The Goliath is threatening to, break David in half and all this other kind of stuff. And David says this, starting in verse 45. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. It's not me that you're defying. It's not me that you're calling names. It's not me that you're criticizing. See, I'm only doing what I'm told to do. So when you're criticizing me, you're actually criticizing the one that I work for. And I may not look that tough to you, and I'm probably not. You're a lot bigger than I am. But you know what? The one I'm working for? What does it say in a VeggieTales song? You're big, the God's bigger. You don't have to worry about me. You worry about the one that's behind me. Kind of like the Lion King when Simba's out there facing those hyenas. And he's scared to death. They're going to eat him up. And he opens his mouth to let out a roar, but the roar that comes out is not his, because his father has come up behind him. See, it's not our battle, it's his battle. And if we're doing what he called, now Simba's kind of poor illustration, probably because Simba had actually walked away from the father, okay? He at that time wasn't, but still, God is there to back us up. Anytime we'll ask for God's help, God will back us up. The Lord will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. all those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. It doesn't depend on me. It depends on him. Nehemiah constantly throughout this chapter, actually throughout the whole book, he constantly reminded the people who they were working for. He kept saying, this is not my mission, it's God's mission. The enemy kept trying to distract them with doubt, fear, inferiority, etc. But Nehemiah kept reminding them that God was in charge. And if we're doing what God asks us to do, no matter how many tells me I'm using the word stupid too much, so I'm going to try to avoid that word. No matter how ineffective that method may seem, or how absurd that may seem to us, or to those looking in from the outside, we have to realize that God knows what he's doing. And if we simply follow his plan, do it the way he instructs us, it will succeed. Noah looked pretty ridiculous building a boat out in the middle of the desert. And he got ridiculed for it. But he said, you know what? I'd rather listen to God, even though I look, there's that word again. Even though I may look crazy to you guys, you may think I've lost it. I'd rather listen to God than listen to you. And make fun of me all you want, because all I care about is that God's happy with me. And because he listened to God, it was successful. God accomplished what he wanted to accomplish through Noah. Nehemiah kept reminding the people that God was in charge. And if we're doing what God asks us to do, we will be victorious. That doesn't mean everything will always be easy. If we're trying to accomplish something for God, the devil will try everything he can to stop God's work. You know, sometimes we get discouraged because we're doing, God, you told me to do this, and why is nothing turning out? Why are all these things coming against me? And let me tell you why. It's because you're doing God's work. Did anybody oppose Jesus when he was here on earth? Sure they did. Did anybody oppose Paul for what he was doing? Yeah, but you know what? Unfortunately, most of the time it was even those who claimed to be on the same team. See, a lot of times the opposition comes from those who claim to be part of us. It was the religious leaders that were opposed to Jesus. It was the religious leaders that were opposed to Paul. Most of their accusations, most of the opposition was not even from truly the devils, those who would claim to be part of the devil's team. It's people who claim to be part of God's team. But they were the ones bringing the accusations and causing the problems. If any time we're trying to accomplish something, there will be opposition because everybody won't agree with you. And if they don't agree, they're going to let it known that they don't agree. But instead of listening to them, if we know that we're called of God and we know we're doing what God asked us to do, we need to shut out all that noise and simply say, God, I'm going to listen to you. You put it in my heart again. You reinforce the vision. You give me your plan. You give me your strategy, and I'm going to do it your way. We need to keep our eye on the goal and remember who is ultimately in charge. Which brings us to the fifth and final principle for today. Now, there are actually a few more in there that I could have pulled out, but I didn't want to get too many. The fifth principle, stick together. Prior to the opposition, many of the workers would come to Jerusalem during the day to work and then travel back to their homes outside the city at night. But in verse 22, Nehemiah asked everyone to stay in the city 24 hours a day. It kind of goes back to our message last week on being a team. By staying together, it was easier to have some keep watch while others worked. You might say they had each other's backs. If one person got tired, there was someone else to step in and take their part of the load. If someone got discouraged, there was someone else there to give a little encouragement. If someone was threatened, there was someone else to help defend them. When we work together as a team, we all accomplish more than one person could accomplish on their own. Remember, that was our theme last week? Team. Together, everyone accomplishes more. Nehemiah said, we're in this together. Let's do this together. God placed us in this body of believers here, not so that we can just come and worship him, and not just so that we can do good things for the community, but he put us here in this body as a means to overcome our trials by working together. No Christian should ever feel like they're alone in their struggles. Actually, to be honest, nobody in the world should feel like they're alone in their struggles either, because we should be there, and if we see somebody that looks like they have a need, we should be willing to go up to them and say, hey, you look like something's bothering you. You want to talk about it? You want to pray about it? Nobody should have to go through life feeling like they're all alone. But it's our job as believers to make sure that doesn't happen. The world's not going to do it that way. The world actually encourages people to be individuals and do their own thing and don't care about anybody else. We should know better. That wasn't in my notes. We're put here in this community as a means to overcome our trials by working together. Because we have the opportunity to join together and stand against those outside forces that would try to discourage us, try to get us to give up, try to get us to quit. If we're all in unity, working together to fulfill God's vision, then nothing can stop us. Let me say that again. If we work together towards the common vision, nothing can stop us. We will be successful because it didn't start with any of us. It also doesn't end with any of us. We just do our part right in the middle. And the victory is God's, but we share in the victory because we partnered with him. It's not over. No matter how tough it gets, no matter how many people come against us in opposition, no matter how many naysayers there are, it's not over till God says it's over. We just need to stop listening to the antagonists and the negativists and the naysayers that says it can't work, say it can't work that way. We need to keep our eye on the goal, God's goal, and his strategy. Nehemiah kept going back to God. A lot of times it doesn't say what he's really asking for, but anytime he faced a problem or an obstacle or didn't know what to do, he always went to God and he prayed. And then it always says, and then he got back to work. Well, in between there is leaving out part of it. He prayed and God gave him the answer. And then he went back to work, sometimes tweaking it, sometimes adjusting it, but getting on God's track. And because they remembered who was in charge, they were successful. Maybe you're here this morning and you're going through a battle. It might be spiritual, it might be something else. You don't have to go through that battle alone. First off, God's there for you. But you also have a family of believers here. And sometimes we just need to go to somebody and say, you know what, I'm really struggling right now. Could I talk to you about it? Would you pray with me about it? Some people aren't brave enough to do that. So the rest of us, if we're on a high note right now, everything's going smooth for us. You got to realize there are some people in here that's probably not going that smooth. We need to look for those people and go to them and say, hey, it looks like there's something really weighing you down. How can I help you? How can I take part of the burden? How can I point you back to God? Because anytime we're facing something and it's causing discouragement, it's because we've gotten our eyes on the problem and off of God. When we keep our eyes on God, we move towards him. We're in this together. Let's choose our battles. Let's not fight the ones that don't need to be fought. But let's be ready to fight when something needs to be done, but let's do it together, not as individuals. And let's not be fighting each other. Let's realize who the real enemy is. Let's go out against him.